Something pretty unusual is happening way down in South Africa right now. See, South Africa is one of the only places in Africa where you'll find both black and white people living together in big numbers. Most of the population is black, but there's a significant white minority, mainly descendants of European settlers called Afrikaners. Since the end of apartheid, that was a time when white people were in charge and made unfair laws that hurt black South Africans. Things have mostly been calm. People were trying to move on and build a new country together. But earlier this year, things got tense. Out of nowhere, a big decision from the United States stirred the pot. Back in February, President Donald Trump signed an order that caught a lot of people off guard. It basically accused the South African government of turning a blind eye to attacks on white farmers and passing a law that allows farmland to be taken away from white landowners without paying them back. And that's not all. According to reports, nearly 70,000 white South Africans, most of them Afrikaners, are now looking for a way out. They say the current government is treating them unfairly just because of their race. They're even calling it persecution. So what did Trump do? He stepped in, saying the US would open its doors to these Afrikaners. His order told top US officials, Marco Rubio and Kristi Noem, to start helping these white South Africans get refugee status, fast-tracking them through the system. Basically, the plan was to move them to the US and let them start fresh under the refugee program. If you are still watching this video, it means you love it. Why not take out a second and hit that like button? Have you done that? Let us move on. So get this, nearly 70,000 people in South Africa, mostly from a group called the Afrikaners, have shown interest in something pretty unexpected, moving to the United States under a plan suggested by former US President Donald Trump. That's right, a while ago, Trump said he wanted to help white South Africans, who, he claimed, were being treated unfairly by their country's black-led government. He even talked about giving them refugee status in the US, which basically means offering them safety and a fresh start. And now, thousands of people seem ready to take him up on that offer. The US Embassy in South Africa confirmed that they've received a big list, over 67,000 names, from a group called the South African Chamber of Commerce in the US. This group has suddenly become a go-to spot for Afrikaners asking, hey, how do we sign up for this? But here's the twist. This list isn't full of official applications. It's more like a giant RSVP, just names of people saying, we're interested, tell us more. When reporters asked someone at the US Embassy in Pretoria, that's South Africa's capital, about it, they admitted the list had been received, but didn't say much else. The president of the chamber said most people on the list are in their 20s to 40s and have kids. He also said they've been flooded with messages, calls, emails, you name it, ever since Trump made his announcement. Because of all that interest, the group reached out to the US State Department and the embassy, asking, can we get an official place where people can sign up or at least get more info? So far, crickets. Neil Diamond, no, not the singer, just someone involved in the process, explained that only US officials can actually take real refugee applications. So even though tens of thousands of people have raised their hands and said, yes, we want in, the US government hasn't officially opened the door or even responded to the knock. Now here's where it gets even more confusing. Trump has always said he's all about America first, right? He's made it really clear that he wants to slow down immigration. In fact, he took some pretty tough steps while he was in office, like removing all 54 African countries from the list of nations allowed to travel to the US without a visa. He also paused refugee programs that pay for people's flights to the US, and even stopped funding for groups that help refugees settle once they arrive. Now here's where things get really puzzling. President Trump has been pretty loud about wanting to cut back on refugees coming into the US. He's even frozen big parts of the resettlement program before. So this whole idea of offering a home to tens of thousands of white South Africans, it doesn't exactly line up with his usual close the borders stance. That's why nobody really knows if he's serious about following through. Nearly 70,000 people have shown interest, but will Trump actually let them in? What do you think he'll do? But wait, it gets weirder. Some of the very same Afrikaner groups that have been shouting the loudest about unfair land laws in South Africa are now turning down Trump's offer. Groups like AfriForum and the Solidarity Trade Union have been front and centre in the fight against land reforms. They say the government's plan to take back land without paying white owners is unfair, especially to people who've worked that land for generations. And it's not just land. They've also raised a fuss about a new language law that's cutting down on Afrikaans in schools, plus business rules that make companies hire more black South Africans. They argue these things are unfair and even call them reverse racism. One of AfriForum's top voices, a guy named Creole, actually thanked Trump for speaking up about what Afrikaners are going through. But even then, their group didn't jump on the refugee plan. Now here's something most people don't know. AfriForum hasn't just been focused on South African politics. They've also been busy trying to cozy up to big names in the US, especially Elon Musk. Yup, that Elon Musk. For years, AfriForum has been pushing this idea that white farmers in South Africa are being hunted down just because they're white. They called it white genocide. This claim, though debunked, somehow made its way to Trump's ears. In fact, back in 2018, Trump tweeted that he'd asked the US Secretary of State to look into South African land seizures and the so-called killings of white farmers. That's when people really started paying attention, and not all in a good way. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate groups and extremism, called AfriForum's leaders white supremacists in suits, polished on the outside but pushing dangerous ideas underneath. And here's the curveball. Elon Musk, who grew up in South Africa during the apartheid era, is now working closely with Trump. He's got a fancy new title, head of the Department of Government Efficiency, and he's been repeating the same AfriForum-style warnings, claiming that Afrikaner farmers are under attack and that a white genocide might be on the horizon. But here's the kicker. Investigations have shown that Musk and AfriForum have been stretching the truth, or just plain wrong. That whole genocide, because apparently it helps Musk make a business case. See, he's been trying to bring his Starlink satellite internet service into South Africa. But the South African government has a rule. If you want to do big business there, at least 30% of it must be owned by black South Africans. It's part of their plan to fix the damage caused by decades of apartheid. Musk didn't like that rule. He refused to meet the requirement. He tried to get an exemption. The government said no. So instead of following the rules, Musk flipped the script. He accused South Africa of having racist ownership laws, claiming the system was biased against him. Meanwhile, something odd has been happening behind the scenes. A group called AfriForum, which says it stands up for white South Africans, has been going all out to back Elon Musk in his beef with the South African government. Their latest claim that Musk's satellite internet service, Starlink, isn't allowed to operate in South Africa because it's too white. Yup, they're saying the country's rules, which are designed to include more black-owned businesses in big deals, are unfair to Musk and to white people in general. That's been their pitch, that these laws aren't about fairness or fixing past injustice, but about pushing white folks out. Together, Musk and AfriForum have been trying to tie everything, land reform, farmer tax, business rules, into one big story, that the current government is targeting white people on purpose. Now here's where it gets wild. AfriForum doesn't even call apartheid a serious injustice. No joke. Their CEO, a guy named Callie Creel, once said apartheid wasn't a crime against humanity because, according to him, not enough people died. Let that sink in for a second. Back in 2018, Creel and his deputy flew all the way to the US to talk to Trump's team. Their mission: convince the White House that South Africa's white minority was being picked on. They used the country's high crime rates, especially murders of white farmers, to paint a picture of racial violence. They even compared it to what happened in Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe forced white farmers off their land. But here's the truth. Most attacks on farmers, while tragic, aren't about race or politics. South Africa has a serious crime problem, and everyone, black, white, rich, poor, is affected. And when farmers are killed, their land isn't being taken by the government. That just doesn't happen. Still, when Elon Musk started butting heads with South African officials in 2024 over Starlink, AfriForum jumped right in again. They launched a campaign claiming that Musk's satellite service could help rural white farmers stay connected and even stay safe, but was being blocked because of so-called anti-white policies. Their message: if the government doesn't let Starlink in, they're putting people's lives at risk. They ended their public statement with "Stop the racism, fight with AfriForum." It was dramatic and more than a little misleading. Now here's where things take an even stranger turn. If all of this was really about survival, if white South Africans were truly living in fear every day, you'd think they'd be jumping at the chance to leave, right? Trump had floated the idea of offering refugee status to them. So did they take him up on it? Not really. In fact, they turned it down. AfriForum's own leader, Callie Creel, said that moving to another country like the US might mean losing their culture, their language, their identity. To him, that was too big a price to pay, even if it meant safety. They claimed to speak for around 2 million Afrikaners and made it clear, we might not agree with the ANC, but we love our country. Even Orania, a self-contained whites-only town in South Africa, rejected the idea of leaving. Their message was simple: we're not going anywhere. So that leaves us with some big questions. If they truly believed they were being persecuted, Why stay? Why pass up the chance to go live freely in America? Maybe it's because deep down, they know something they aren't saying out loud. Maybe it's because, even with all the noise about discrimination, white South Africans still hold most of the land, most of the wealth, and most of the business power. Let's rewind back to 1950, when the South African government came up with a rule that sorted every single person into 3 boxes. You were either Bantu, which meant Black African, coloured, which meant mixed race, or white. That was it. No middle ground. But that wasn't even the worst part. That same year, the government passed something called the Group Areas Act. And if you've never heard of it, here's what it did. It split cities and towns into zones based on race. White people got to live and work in certain places. Everyone else? Not allowed. You couldn't own a business there. You couldn't buy land. You couldn't even live there. Imagine being kicked out of your own home just because of your skin colour. And that's exactly what happened. Thousands of black, coloured, and Indian families were forced to pack up and leave. Their homes were bulldozed, their neighbourhoods were wiped out. And also those areas could be turned into white-only spaces. By the mid-1950s, a series of laws, people now call them the Land Acts, basically handed over about 80% of South Africa's land to the white minority. Just like that. To keep this system in place, the government came up with pass laws. If you weren't white, you had to carry a special passbook that said where you were allowed to be. If you were caught in the wrong part of town without it, you could be arrested, no questions asked. Then came Hendrik Verwoerd in 1958. He became Prime Minister and decided apartheid wasn't extreme enough. So he gave it a new spin. He called it separate development. Sounds harmless, right? It wasn't. In 1959, he introduced a law to create so-called homelands for black South Africans. 10 of them. The idea was to separate black communities from each other, to make it seem like there wasn't one united black majority. That way, it would be harder for people to join together and demand equal rights. But it gets worse. Whole villages were uprooted. Families were dragged off the land they had lived on for generations. From the 1960s all the way to the early 90s, more than 3.5 million black South Africans were kicked out of their homes and dumped into overcrowded, underdeveloped regions with no real jobs, no schools, no hospitals, nothing. And the land they were forced to leave, sold off to white farmers for cheap. And while all of this was happening, the rest of the world said nothing. No outrage, no help. Just silence as people's lives were torn apart. Fast forward to today, and here's the wild part. A law meant to fix this terrible history and return stolen land to black South Africans is now being called racist by some. A law that hasn't even been fully rolled out yet. A law that doesn't even mention seizing white-owned land without pay. And yet, suddenly, there's outrage from the US and other countries acting like it's the greatest injustice ever. Where was all this concern when entire communities were erased? Where was this global defence of human rights when black South Africans were forced into poverty, treated like trespassers in their own country? But while the world stayed quiet, something powerful began to rise inside South Africa. People stood up. They refused to stay silent. One of them was a young lawyer named Nelson Mandela. He helped start the country's first black law firm, and he became a leading voice in the African National Congress, a group that fought to protect the rights and freedoms of black South Africans. In the beginning, Nelson Mandela believed in peaceful protest. No shouting, no violence, just firm resistance. He and others in the African National Congress, ANC, tried using marches, strikes and speeches to push back against the system that treated black South Africans like second-class citizens. One of their boldest moves came in 1952. That year, they launched what was called the Defiance Campaign. Thousands of black South Africans burned their passbooks, broke curfews, and walked into whites-only areas without permission. They knew what was coming, arrest. But that was the point. Over 8,000 people ended up in jail, including Mandela. But the goal wasn't just to fill cells, it was to make the world pay attention, and it worked. Suddenly, Mandela wasn't just a lawyer in a quiet office. He was a national figure, the face of a growing movement. But the government wasn't backing down either. In 1956, Mandela and more than 150 others were put on trial for treason, simply for standing up for basic rights. It took years, but they were eventually cleared. Still, things were getting more intense. Then came a moment that changed everything. In 1960, while Mandela was serving a short sentence, something terrible happened in the township of Sharpeville. A group of peaceful protesters from a rival group, the Pan-African Congress, gathered outside a police station. They came without their passes and asked to be arrested as a statement. But instead of handcuffs, they got bullets. Police opened fire, killing 67 unarmed people and injuring over 180 more. After that, Mandela and others realised that peaceful protests alone weren't working. The government was too brutal, so in 1962, Mandela slipped out of the country to seek military training and gather support for armed resistance. But not long after returning, he was caught. His crime? Leaving the country without permission. And that's when the police found something big: secret papers detailing plans for guerrilla warfare. That discovery led to a major case known as the Rivonia trial, named after the place where the police had found the documents. Mandela, along with other key leaders like Walter Sisulu and Govan Mbeki, faced charges that could have gotten them executed. They knew it. So instead of playing defense in court, they used the trial to speak directly to the world. They exposed the cruelty of apartheid and explained why they had turned to armed resistance. It was risky, but powerful. Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life in prison. He would spend the next 27 years behind bars. It wasn't until April 27th, 1994, decades later, that South Africa held its first democratic election where everyone could vote, no matter their skin colour. Mandela won, and with that victory, apartheid, the legal system that had divided the country for so long, was officially over. But here's the thing: ending a law on paper doesn't erase the damage it caused. When the ANC came into power, people expected sweeping change. New homes, better schools, fairer laws. And while some improvements came, others didn't. The government had to deal with pressure from the outside, especially from global investors who didn't want anything too radical. They didn't want land redistribution. They didn't want laws that gave black South Africans a real economic leg up. Between 1994 and 2004, the ANC did build nearly 2 million houses, but most of them were in the same areas where black people had been forced to live during apartheid. No new land, no new opportunities, just new buildings in old segregated neighbourhoods. And here's the kicker: many of those residents didn't even legally own the land their homes sat on. Access to clean water, electricity, or decent public services was often spotty. Getting to work in the city meant spending hours and money commuting, only to earn less than $15 a day. Back in 1994, there were about 300 townships and informal settlements scattered across the country. Now, that number has exploded to nearly 2,700. The gap between rich and poor hasn't closed. If anything, it's widened. Places like Cape Town and Durban still have beachfront neighbourhoods that look like European resorts. But drive a little further inland, and it's a different world entirely. Let's take a look at Cape Town for a second. It's one of South Africa's most famous cities, with beaches, mountains, and luxury homes. But there's another side to it that people don't talk about as much. About 6 out of every 10 people in Cape Town live in places called townships, areas that were originally built during apartheid to keep black people separated from white neighbourhoods. And even today, those places still don't have enough schools, hospitals, or basic services. Jobs are few and far between, and families often have to travel long distances just to find work that barely pays the bills. Now zoom out and look at the whole country. As of 2019, nearly 8 out of 10 people in South Africa were black. White people made up less than 1 out of 10. But when you look at who's making real money, like earning more than $60,000 a year, it's a different story. For every black South African who reaches that income level, there are about 20 white South Africans already there. Even today, most black families still live in the same crowded neighbourhoods that were created during apartheid. Many live in small, informal homes made from sheet metal and scrap wood. And they're stuck in a cycle. Low-paying jobs, poor public schools, limited healthcare, and very few chances to break out and move up. So when people talk about laws that could give land back to black South Africans, the land their families were once forced off of, they're not just talking about land. They're talking about fixing a system that was built to leave them behind. If you found this video interesting, be sure to hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.